I'm Carrie Brayman, the director of the Gender Institute, and it's terrific to see so many faces here at this crazy, hectic time of the semester. Well, this is our last FRA event, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about Dr. Segol's work, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies, and a recent recipient of the Gender Institute's Faculty Research Award last year, I believe. She writes about the Kabbalah, the history of the body, in religion. She focuses on the forbidden knowledges of the early modern period, the occult, mysticism, and astrology, and the ways in which medieval knowledge of sacred sexuality informs our own contemporary New Age culture. And I'm fascinated by how she connects sacred with popular culture historically and today. I loved her article on contemporary self-help literature, so I'm really, really looking forward to it. She's the author of Word and Image in Medieval Kabbalah, the text, commentaries, and diagrams of the Okay, thank you. That was a tough one. And the Sexuality, Sociality, and Cosmology in Medieval Literary Texts. And you're finishing up a book called Tracing the Body Divine, A History of Human and Divine Bodies in Jewish Esoteric Literature. So join me in welcoming Marla to the Gender Institute.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out on this crazy day. I'm so excited to see everybody. I'm glad you're here, and I also want to thank the Gender Institute for helping to fund this project. I really appreciate it. So now we'll start. This paper explores the contemporary practice of sacred sexuality. It is, in some ways, an accidental paper. In researching it last October, I sought out and interviewed community teachers of ritual sacred sexuality to understand if and how they were using Kabbalistic, discursive, or ritual models of sacred sexuality. I purposely sought teachers who operated through the Meetup platform, which is a grassroots site for organizing local activities around particular interests. I did not seek out Jewish women teachers. In fact, I sought out people who are unaffiliated with any institutional religion, but I found these people just the same. Similarly, these Jewish teachers do not consciously use Jewish mystical rituals, but they use them nevertheless, combined with a wide variety of other sources. So I went into this thinking, okay, I'm just going to find some teachers on Meetup of sacred sexuality. Almost all women, almost all Jewish. Go figure. In conducting my interviews, I learned first that many innovate rituals independent of a single mythological tradition, but engaged instead with different powerful discourses from inside religious traditions and from outside them. Second, I learned that they assign to sex magic rituals a therapeutic function intended to act on individuals, groups, and society as a whole. Finally, I learned that the innovators of these rituals intend them to heal in several different ways. So first, to revise shaming narratives, often religious, about sexuality and the female body, to intervene in insufficient or harmful psychotherapeutic models for healing, and to revise medical models with inherent gender biases. At the same time, they use Jewish mystical, Kabbalistic models of sacred sexuality to repair the cosmos, and this is a cosmos that they think of as bi-gendered, and they think of that cosmos as operating by means of sexual reproduction. So the idea then, there's a cosmos with 10 different elements in it, male and female, and when they unite, blessings flow down to the world. Okay, so that's what they're thinking of. These Jewish practitioners are therefore enacting Jewish mystical models combined with many others, which they sometimes do and sometimes do not conceptualize as religious models. This provides a valuable opportunity to re-theorize both ritual and New Age religion. So this makes good sense, what they're doing, in light of the history of Western esotericism, which can be partly credited for the contemporary practice of sacred sexuality. As Hugh Urban has argued, contemporary sex magic has roots in several traditions combined and passed down together via the Western esoteric tradition. Jewish mysticism is a central component in it, introducing key principles to its practice that are both altered and amplified by its interactions with its other constituent traditions, like the other traditions of Western esotericism. This mode of transmission did not leave the constituent traditions unchanged, but it modified them to suit its users' purposes and their sensibilities. As sacred sexuality rituals moved from Kabbalistic circles to New Age communities, several concrete changes in their practice took place as well. First, they were combined with Buddhist and Hindu models. Second, they moved out of men's hands and into women's. Third, they moved away from scripted ritual performance toward a more fluid and improvised form. To show the changes in these relationships, I'm going to establish a baseline by summarizing my previous research on early Jewish Kabbalistic models for sex magic and their development of ritual scripts. In examining contemporary sources, I will show both common elements and changes to the ritual. So this is section 1 on the ancient texts. In early Jewish texts, sex magic begins with the conception of a sexualized human-divine relationship that is ultimately messianic. This is based in biblical myths of divine creation by means of sexual reproduction, combined with rabbinic interpretations of the biblical Song of Songs that viewed the covenant between God and Israel as a love relationship that would bring redemption. And it's a sexual relationship. Based on these components, expressed in late antique prayer and in esoteric texts such as the Shir Koma, which is the measurement of the divine body, and the Sefer HaBahir, which is ironically entitled the Book of Clarity. Yeah, it's so far from clear. So they believe that human sexuality emulates and therefore invokes the primordial creation, unites human beings with the divine, and allows access to divine power. So because these early authors understood ritualized human sexuality as an emulation of the divine, they believe that this power could be used for the betterment or the salvation of the individual and eventually the whole cosmos. Late antique Jewish esoteric texts, like the Shir Koma and the Sefer Bahir, view that relationship as a source of power for transformation and redemption for the individual and for society. So medieval Kabbalistic texts, they take up that eroticized human-divine relationship and they use it as a model for messianic ritual practice. So the early texts, they give you the conceptual framework, and then the medieval texts, they ritualize it, okay? So then early modern texts develop detailed ritual instructions, even scripts, for acting on the cosmological models that are articulated in the early texts. In this way, the Jewish model for sex magic is built on biblical myths of divine sexuality, ritualized so that human imitation provides access to divine, creative, curative, and redemptive power. So because time is short, I'm going to summarize some of the key elements from these texts, okay? And then I'm going to compare them to contemporary practice, okay? As Hugh Urban notes, the ritual model underlying contemporary sex magic first appears intact in the 13th century Zohar, which is the Book of Splendor. Okay? Earlier models either describe a human divine sexuality or they assert that human sexuality imitates divine creation without providing any ritual scripts for its enaction. The Zohar is the first that describes a ritual model to be enacted by two human partners. Urban quotes a passage from it to show it, but in truth, there are many. So here's one from him. When a man cleaves to his mate and his, there we go. When a man cleaves to his mate and his desire is to receive her, he worships before the Holy King and arouses another union. For the desire of the Holy One, blessed be he, is to cleave to the community of Israel. Here, human sexuality is presented as an imitation of the divine. It happens on two levels. First, it emulates the same union between the divine and the community of Israel, as described in the Song of Songs and in the Shir Koma. And second, it invokes, so there are two unions. There's the human divine, and then there's union between the different parts of the divine. Both of these unions are messianic in their aim, as shown in other parts of the Zohar. Just a bit later, as you can see right here, the Zohar has the human lovers take up the positions of the characters in the Song of Songs to bestow blessings on the world. So this is Zohar 342a, and this is 13th century. Rabbi Eliezer began by quoting, By night on my bed, I sought him whom my soul loves. The assembly of Israel said, concerning my bed, I pleaded with him that he might lie with me and give me pleasure and bless me with perfect delight. For we have learned that as a result of the king's cohabitation with the assembly of Israel, large numbers of the righteous come into their sacred inheritance, and a multitude of blessings are bestowed upon the world. Here, ritualized human sexuality emulates intra-divine cohabitation. It also imitates the cohabitation of the divine with the whole community of Israel, okay? The result is a layering of sexualities, human divine, community divine, and intra-divine, all evoked by ritualized human sex, which unites all of these elements, okay? So all the same elements here are present as in earlier text, which I didn't go over with you. But the thing that the Zohar and the texts around that period bring us is they bring us this. They bring us that. So this is a popular depiction of the model of the 10 Sfirot. So these 10 Sfirot, represented by the circles, they each represent an aspect of the divine, right? So when people are talking about inter-divine sexuality, they're talking about union between mostly here, this is beauty, and that's a male aspect. And there's Malchut or Shekhinah, and that's female. And so they're talking about union between these two so that blessings can come down from above to us on earth, lucky us, right? So that's what they're talking about, okay? So, and that's the model that paves the way for Western versions of sex magic, okay? And what's interesting about this model too is that it actually allows for human participants to take up different roles in the drama, to imagine yourself as maybe I'm going to be Tiferet because I want to, right? and then the other person can be Shekhinah, and then you can act it out. Before there was this model, there weren't two human roles available. There was only human and divine. Okay. Next. Any questions, by the way? Yeah.
How many of the 10 are female? Is it just Shekinah? Or
No, the left side is female, the right side is male, and the ones in the middle go female, male, male, female.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's a good question. Okay. Thanks. So let's go on to Moshe Cordovero, okay? Moshe Cordovero lived in Sfat, Palestine, from 1522 to 1570. And he takes both the human and the messianic components further. And he's describing, in this work that I'm using, the Prayer of Moses, a detailed ritual designed to draw down spirits for messianic instruction. So the following translation is taken from Charles Mopsick's article, Sex and the Soul. And he's describing a ritual, like Cordovero is describing a ritual that consists of three components, right? There's a preparation component, there's an action component, and then there's an interpretation component. And so here we go. From Cordovero. Here is its mystery and the meditation required with regard to it. Firstly, one will wash one's hands at midnight or during the hours that follow, and will purify one's consciousness and void the spirit of evil thought. One could also meditate on the repenting of one's faults and prolongs one's prayer according to one's force. Then the man will gladden his wife, i.e. flirt, with speech relating to the commandment of sexual union, at the same time that he will bring his awareness closer to the sacred. Then he will undertake to meditate on the secret of the embrace. He is at the level of Tiferet, the beauty one in the middle, and she is at the level of Malchut, okay? Here's part 2, which provides instructions for the placement of the bodies, along with instructions on how to imagine their interaction. The man will thus embrace the head of the woman with his left arm, which he will place beneath, meditating on the mystery of the Gevura, strength, taking hold of the Malchut, which is royalty, in the joyful aspect in view of coupling, and not in the aspect of judgment or deen. So these are all different spherotic positions. Then with his right hand, he will embrace the head from above in order to include love in the right and the left. So how you position your body is going to determine which elements are brought into the experience based on the model of the Sefirot that I just showed you. Okay? So here's part 3, the interpretation. He will then be aware that body in body, that is to say, the 6 extremities, the 6 lower Sefirot, which are in him rejoined with hers, the 6 extremities which are in her, that is the two thighs, Netzach and Hod, the penis, i.e. Yesod, rejoin the 2 thighs, which are in her. The male completes her, and this member is half included in her and half included in him. Male and female unite in such a manner that the Shiur Koma, which is in him, there are 10 Sefirot, and in that which, that's kind of hard to parse, but it's saying that both people together make up the Shiur Koma, which is the body of God. Okay? That's what this is saying. So when they're having this ritualized sex, their 2 bodies together make up the completed body of God. Okay? So this body has power, obviously. So the 2 bodies together are considered as the creative body of God and the redemptive body of God. And the meditation before and during ritualized sex deifies the 2 bodies and invests them with power, and the whole point is messianic. As in the Zohar, the aim is the reunion of the divided Godhead, and once that is done, blessings can again flow down to earth. So this is the model that the teachers are or are not working with, okay? Any questions? Yeah.
So was it unified and then became divided and needs to be reunified, or was it like, so where did the division come
That's
in?
a great question. So that, I'll go back to this. That model is a model not only of the cosmos, but it's a model of how the cosmos was made. So the way the cosmos was made, according to that story, is that there was a divine overflow. There was a divine emanation, okay? And so when God decided to create, God emanated aspects of the divine being outward into the world, and then used them as vessels to channel the influence down to actually do the creating work. So when God created, God got divided, right? So that's why the reunion is required, right? So when you reunite all the different aspects of God, what you're doing is you're almost undoing creation and bringing everybody back into the Godhead. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
Can I also ask, can you talk a little bit about the image and where it comes from and its clear iconographic debts to Christianity?
Oh yeah, this is not from a manuscript. This is a New Age diagram.
I see.
Yeah, so I have so many from the manuscripts, and they are not like this. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, they're not like this at all. They don't have images.
Right.
So, but some of the Lurianic ones from the 16th century, 17th century Tzfat, they do have images, and instead of being like that, see the one at the top with the beard?
Yeah.
So they actually have the Sefirot going down the hairs of the divine beard, that's not this. Yeah. So I chose this because it's what people are going to use now. They don't use those old ones. Does that help? Okay. So we're going to now move to the teachers section. We see both changes and we see continuities when we speak to New Age practitioners. This is consistent with the early work on New Age religion, which, and early, I mean the 1990s and the 2000s. I mean, New Age religion changes so fast, right? So New Age scholarship, early scholarship on New Age religion defined it as a self-spirituality that was antithetical to ethics, to community, and to institutions. Voucher Hanegraaff discusses the changes as follows. He says, New Age spiritualities, in contrast to institutional religions, do not grow on the soil of an existing religion. They are based upon the individual manipulation of religious as well as non-religious symbolic systems, and this manipulation is undertaken in order to fill these symbols with new religious meaning. So, practitioners of New Age spiritualities substitute non-religious symbolic systems for sacred discourse. Hanegraaff argues that New Agers give a spiritual twist to the symbolism of quantum mechanics and relativity theory, various psychological schools, sociological theories, and so on. At the same time, he argues that the self-spirituality of New Age religion is ultimately solipsistic and antithetical to ethical behavior. So there. And others argue that in decoupling religion from institutions and from shared sacred discourse and community, in shared sacred discourse, community is also dismantled. So this is bad, everybody, don't do it. Okay. Some of these assertions hold true, while others assuredly do not. Specifically, on the one hand, Hanegraaff is quite correct, even now, as he notes that scientific narrative replaces sacred discourse. And on the other, it's no longer the case that the aims of these practitioners are solipsistic and separate from community life. And just as these practitioners use a different set of authoritative discourses, they also change the ritual models to which they are attached. As sacred sexuality rituals moved from Kabbalistic circles to New Age communities, several other shifts took place as well. First, they were combined with Buddhist and Hindu models, mostly Hindu. Second, they moved out of men's hands and into women's. Third, they aimed at changing social and scientific discourse and practice rather than religious. And fourth, they moved away from scripted ritual performance toward a more fluid and improvised form. So these teach us a lot about how new rituals are born and about the women who birthed them in this case. So in order to better understand how the contemporary teachers are using ancient and medieval models of sacred sexuality, I interviewed 5 teachers. There are a growing number of teachers of sacred sexuality in the Northeast region, but there's a concentration of them, surprisingly, in New Paltz, New York, New York City, and the Boston area. So I interviewed teachers. Yeah, it's a delta. It's a sacred delta. So I interviewed teachers from this area, and I started out with 5. This is just the beginning, right? So, and they are Kelle Sparta, Robin Vogel of the Sacred Sexuality Meetup in Somerville, Massachusetts, and Sheri Winston and Ruth Pine of the Body Sacred in New Paltz and in New York City. And in the interest of time, I just left one interview out. I found the first group of teachers through the Meetup site, which is an entirely grassroots site for organizing communities around interests, right? And then they say, get online to get offline, so the whole point is community building. I found the Body Sacred teachers through a friend, but these two are also active in Meetup groups. So in the course of the interviews, which lasted about an hour each, I asked 5 questions derived from Bruce Lincoln's polythetic definition of religion, meaning it says the things that religions have instead of what it is, okay? And so he says that religions have sacred discourse, that's 1. Sacred practices, both ethical and ritual, that's 2. Communities, right? And communities are made up of people who accept the sacred discourse and do the practices, right? And then they have institutions which regulate all 3 of those other things, okay? So the point where I started was to test his idea that rituals enact sacred discourse, meaning that's where you get rituals. They act out these myths, right? And I wanted to better understand the relation between ritual and sacred discourse. So these are the questions that I asked my interviewees, okay? Pretty simple. What is sacred sexuality? How did you come to this teaching, right? And who has been important to your teaching of sacred sexuality? Are there myths and models that you consciously employ? What sort of rituals do you do and where do you get them? And then finally, what is the practice of sacred sexuality do for individuals, for society as a whole, and for women specifically? So that's what I asked. And I arranged the questions around Bruce Lincoln's definition. So we'll start with Kelle Sparta. Kelle Sparta is a co-organizer for the Sacred Sexuality Meetup in Somerville, Massachusetts. Consistent with earlier characterizations of New Age authority, she establishes hers by means of experience. That's very consistent with New Age practice. At the same time, her practice is dynamic, and it's rooted in relationships between people and in the formation of communities around the practice of sacred sexuality, which maintains the ritual structure articulated in pre-modern texts discussed here. So in this way, her authority is actually rooted in the community. At the same time, she does not use practice to rewrite religious discourse, but she uses it to rewrite scientific and therapeutic discourses, and social ones too, okay? So her Meetup, when you're on Meetup, every person has an introduction, right? So this is hers. She says, I'm Kelle Sparta, a tantric shaman. I'm a dakini, which is a self-taught person, like a self-taught healer, empath, and healer by birth, and a shaman by training. I help people create lives they can love, which is good. Okay. Good job, Kelly. No, she was great, actually. She was really great. She considers herself a dakini, drawing upon a rich stock of past life memories and skills to heal. She says, I remember being a priestess in a goddess temple. A lot of what I do comes out of there. At the same time, she came to her teaching accidentally. She started in real estate. And yeah, and then she began by marketing herself as a shaman and a business and life coach. So for her, economic success and a sense of the self as sacred go hand in hand. She said that while practicing coaching in business, though, she says, I wound up talking about sex. So because many people really wanted to talk about that, because sex is such a powder keg issue, a taboo issue. People don't know where to go for information. So she was doing business coaching and talking about sex, okay? So this led her to teaching Tantra and sacred sexuality. She said that this is a huge deal in the Tantra community here. We don't want to lead with sex, but once people get in the door, they'll see that it's a spiritual practice. So in this way, she uses the practice of sacred sexuality to bring people to practice a wider spirituality. She also uses this practice to rewrite models of esoteric and therapeutic traditions. She defines sacred sexuality as, and there we are with the first one, when two people can come together in a conscious and intentional fashion and bring their full selves into process about divine union. It operates on a God and goddess concept. This is highly effective. She views sacred sexuality as a means of integrating the two different paths of mystical practice, at the same time that she uses a Jungian model to imagine an integrated self. But she uses ritual to replace talk therapy or analysis. She explains that sacred sexuality unites Western and Eastern esoteric traditions, the Jungian mystical paths of light and darkness, and the masculine and feminine within the individual. She says that for most spiritual practices, the Christian, the more Western path is primarily masculine. And even there, it's only if you step into the mystical side, based on the masculine path from the heart chakra up, stripping away of ego and self to become nothing, to become one with everything. So, mapping it onto Jungian symbols, she explains that the masculine path is the path of light, the feminine path, on the other hand, is the path of darkness. She believes that the feminine path requires a different approach. It is a path of darkness. You have to be in the dark to experience darkness, path of accepting and receiving all that is until you become all that is. Oops, here we go. In her mind, the goal is to travel both at the same time, stripping away into nothingness and the path of receiving into everything. That is the path of enlightenment, she says. The end goal is the integration of the masculine and the feminine and the self, so that when you get into the more advanced balancing masculine and feminine within sexual union, if both are fully versed in both sides, then you can move into whatever seems more useful for you at the moment. So there is some gender essentialism happening, but it's not actually attached to your body. Okay? So she believes that happiness and personal power depend on this widening of the spiritual process. In reimagining ritual practice, she proposes another model for psychotherapy. She writes that, and this is from her website, she says, therapy can only go so far before you have to admit that the therapy isn't working anymore. The problem is not the therapy. It's that the therapy is essentially designed to make you functional, to remove the triggers and stories that keep you stuck. And it's great at that. But when it comes to being happy, there's so much more to it. So instead, she relies on an intuitive process of ritual construction and ritual process to get people unstuck. That's what she says. I'm all about the ritual. I love the ritual. We have little context for ritual. When you talk to people about ritual, they get weird. They think about rejected Catholicism or paganism. They have no context for ritual as a sacred practice. The challenge for her is to get them over their preconceived notions. So she constructs her own sensuality rituals to accomplish this. She says outright, I make them up. I begin with the situation at hand and the end in mind. So she explains, once you know where you're going, you think about who you're going to take there, their limitations. Then you lay out the steps for getting there. Once you know the steps, then you can look for a good metaphor. You really want to look for a metaphor, because then you can access the archetypal. So it is this ritual sensuality, acting with the body and through metaphor and not analysis, that will enact the Jungian unity of masculine and feminine. And in this way, she writes Jungian therapy as an esoteric ritual practice and a way to modify religious practice and discourse, right? I mean, well, maybe not discourse, just religious practice, okay? So Ms. Sparta uses rituals that she makes up. She improvises and innovates by assessing individual needs and the total emotional, spatial, and communal situation of the participants. The rituals are transformative on several different levels. First, they're meant to heal individual pain caused by religious and gender normative discourse that alienates women from their bodies and their sexualities, working as a form of cultural, she said, these are his words, cultural deprogramming to counter sex negativity and victim and perpetrator culture. Second, it's meant to intervene in therapeutic models that are at best insufficient and at worst harmful. Third, on the ritual discursive level, the Jungian union between male and female, not understood biologically but symbolically to her, integrates two different traditions of esotericism, Eastern, receptive and female, and Western, ascetic and male, to create an integrative spiritual practice. Fourth, on the cosmic level, the ritual union of two bodies is meant to affect the union of human and divine, as it also reunites masculine and feminine aspects of divinity. So she believes that this practice can transform individuals, society, and even divinity. So it's healing, it's salvific, and it's ultimately messianic to reconstitute the divine, just as in earlier models of sex magic. Any questions about Kelle? Yeah.
I don't have a question about her, but I'm curious, what has made this practice or those teaching it go from male to female hands?
It's such a great question. I think, because, I mean, I can tell you the situation in which it is possible, which is that this is outside of institutions. That's one thing, okay? The other thing is that it's grassroots. The other, I would say, is, I can't say that this is the cause, but when I did an article based on interviews a few years back, it's called Kabbalah and the Sisterhood, and it's about the teaching of Kabbalah in synagogues, Jewish mysticism in synagogues, and one after the next, the women who did the teaching told me that almost everyone who took their class was female. And the reason they thought so is because it's full of images that now appeal to women, right? There's a lot of marriage imagery. It's also the one place where the feminine is actually divinized, right? She's divinized in the form of the last of the Sfirot, Malchut or Shekhinah, right? And so she is the gateway to the divine. And so it appeals to women in that way. That's what the teachers told me. So I don't know if that helps.
But men were teaching this previously.
In the past they were.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah, in the past they were. The institutions, I would say it has to do with probably with the Enlightenment, where Jewish institutions moved away from ritual practice and more into kind of discursive orthodoxy. And then the men stopped doing this, but the women took it up to find themselves a place in synagogue life and in the cosmos. But as far as these women, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I think you were first, and then you're second. Go ahead.
I'm kind of piggybacking on that question. I'm from a Sephardic Jewish home.
Yes.
And what you're saying is fascinating, because one thing I wanted to add is, in our tradition, which is Spanish,
Yeah.
all the sexuality is quite desexualized from the point of view of the woman. This is the man speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Because women were not allowed to read the Kabbalah. If you are a Kabbalist in the Sephardic community, you still do not do it. The way it is taught is quite interesting, because
Let's
it's
hear.
from a very machista point of view.
Yeah.
And what has always kind of fascinated and shocked me in the New Age interpretation of the Kabbalah is how it can be given as something feminist, because it was not meant to. Lilith is not the ideal.
Certainly
For you
not.
to imitate.
She's the
Lilith-
demoness, and you should not
Exactly.
kill babies like she does.
Exactly. Just one thing I would like to add to your excellent presentation.
Thanks.
One of, I think, our most important thinkers, one of the most important thinkers of modern day Sephardic Jewish tradition, Kasuto,
Uh-huh.
when speaking about the way the Kabbalah is taught in terms of female sexuality, mentioned the fact that if you decontextualize it and take it out of 13th century Spain,
Mm-hmm.
so you're not only talking machismo, you're talking 13th century.
Right.
You are really deliberately, Kasuto said, not wanting to understand where it's from.
Where what's from?
The male-based sexuality, which, although it celebrates the female, it's from the male point of view.
Of course it is. Right, but what's interesting is that the Haskalah does desexualize the Kabbalah, but if you read Cordovero, he's telling you where to put your body.
Yeah.
Like, it is very much from the masculine point of view, but the sex is there, right? So what's happened now is that the sex has been reintroduced and it's been claimed by women. Yeah.
How do you have, and just a personal question, how do you react to that personally?
To
knowing-
which?
To the kind of, I have no problem with reclaiming the sexuality as a woman, but sometimes I feel the Kabbalah is misrepresented in terms of, oh, this is a feminist tract by a lot of New Age proponents, and it is not. There's no way the Kabbalah can be imagined as a proto-feminist tract.
Oh, it's not proto-feminist, but, well, this is a big conversation. But one of the things that I will say is that at least in the Tzfat school Kabbalah, like the 16th century in Tzfat, and Cordovero, and Chaim Vital, they all have their Rachel Aberlins, right? And many of these male Kabbalists had women patronesses who they studied with. And while they aren't really they're mentioned in diaries, but they're certainly not mentioned in the work. But so I think in terms of the cultural setting, men and women were both involved with it. But I think when things got de-ritualized, and they were further masculinized, and they were also disembodied. So that's what I think. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask about what seems to be the persistence of a heterosexist model here, given the fact that if Godhead, right,
Yeah.
de-essentializes sexuality to the degree that it does, why in specifically women's community, and I should say that, I come from San Francisco, it's a very different, right, scene in San Francisco.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. And I have to tell you that once I started getting to the West Coast, which I did talk to some people from the West Coast, I found, and also in Boston, there were many men who ran these sacred sexuality groups for gay men. I'm just not talking about them, right?
Well,
so
but
there's
I'm
that.
talking about
Oh, I
also
know.
about women doing them for women.
Yeah. So you can get away with a lot with young. Right? So, and I think that's how they justify what they're doing. And they did say to me, listen, it's this gendering, like the masculine and the feminine, they're not attached to your body. And they say, and many of them are very careful to say, oh, actually we both have the masculine and feminine within us. But they really stick to the Jungian model. So I think that's how we account for it. They say, oh, well, we can keep this heterosexual model or this heterosexist model because yeah, exactly. So that's and they say they can do it because it's actually just ways to name parts of us.
Yeah, cop-out.
Yeah, it's cop-out. That's what they do. But maybe when I talk to more people, I'll find something different. Okay, are we good? All right, let's go on. Now we're going to talk about Robin Vogel, who I have to say, if you found Kelle Sparta a little bit heterosexist, this will be worse. So she co-organizes the same meetup. She's a trained psychotherapist and a couples counselor. her responses are similar to Ms. Sparta's in some ways and different in others. They're similar insofar as they follow the messianic model of earlier sources and as they rewrite psychoanalytic narrative with ritual. But they're different because of her focus on the couple, her views of gender, and in her greater focus on the social and on the messianic aspect. Ms. Vogel uses a variety of mythological models for conceptualizing her practice. She was raised Jewish, and there are some echoes of a Kabbalistic cosmology in her work, but she mainly relies on westernized conceptions of Hindu practice. Just as Kelle Sparta works to revise conceptions of gender, she does as well, using a Hindu model instead of a Jungian one, and idealizing a much more conservative model over and against the diminishing distinction of gender roles in contemporary North American life. So she defines sacred sexuality as a conscious setting of intention in order to connect on a much deeper level, a much deeper, more conscious way, respectful and honoring, and bringing in spirituality to the experience. Setting intention, being clear and focused, purposeful, right? That's the first piece for her. And then the second piece would be bringing in whatever people define as spirituality. She sees it as a corrective to Western models of gender, in which, according to her, women have more agency than they ought to. Poor us. She uses mainly Hindu models for understanding it, of Shiva and Shakti and the chakras. So I'm going to just show you. Again, this is like that she would use. It's not a traditional model. I'm purposely using Western esotericized models. So she says of this model, it's a story that I speak to because there's a lot of masculine and feminine mix-up in our cultures, causing havoc in our relationships. Women are working a lot, working, doing. The feminine is more about being still and attuning to the flow of the universe. She sees these energies imbalanced in relationships. Women get controlling about things. We're in this sort of...
Men, absolutely not.
No. Well, no, men are supposed to. We're in this sort of overdrive. The man reacts to this by not being in his masculine and letting her control things. Oh, no. I see that a lot. This is a sad and often conflict-ridden dynamic. I think that's the place that needs to be repaired. The masculine should be the riverbank, and the feminine being a river itself. Even more, she believes that for women to have a personal mystical experience of being aware of the flow that is the undercurrent, all we have to do is lay ourselves down as the receiver and respond as things come. So for her example, no, I'm being mean.
You couldn't pay for that.
No. So for her, the experience of the divine is itself gendered, as it is influenced by both Hindu and Jewish esoteric narratives. For Kabbalah means to receive, as ritual corrects contemporary gender roles and narratives. Okay, so it's an important part of her practice, ritual. For her, this is how she describes what she does. Sitting meditation sets the tone in my case for a psychotherapy session. Time to ground, connect to themselves, and see what's there for them in the moment. In the second session, she says, I invite them to center and do another guided meditation. For her, the target of the ritual is both personal and social. This occurs in two different ways. First is the reinscription of gender roles, so that when men and women are properly gendered, in the context of sacred sexuality, it's possible to have a direct experience of the divine. In this way, the sanctity of sacred sexuality is grounded in the social. When I asked her what she thought sacred sexuality could do for people, she answered, here we go. My God, that's the answer. It brings people to God. It brings people to their hearts and to what they're really craving. If we want to get more into the spiritual aspects of it, people are craving a connection to something much greater than themselves. I tried to fill that void with food and all kinds of things that aren't on target, instead of the spiritual level, knowing that I'm cared for and looked after. In terms of their relationships, they're getting much deeper, a much more spiritual connection. They're getting presence. So here we see human presence as an analogy to divine presence. Ritual then operates first on gender, then on human relations, and then on the experience of the divine. In the interest of time, I'll just skip this next bit, but she says that raising orgasmic energy repairs the cosmos, mainly. And that's related to the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, which is the repair of the world or the cosmos.
And related to Reich.
And related to?
Reich. Wilhelm Reich.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can read that, and we're going to go on, okay? Any questions about her? We're good? We'll talk about her later. Okay, so for the... I know, it feels a little gossipy and wrong. They're alive. Okay, so the next two interviews we'll examine come from two members of the Body Sacred. They are Sheri Winston and Ruth Pine. Ms. Winston is a teacher of sacred sexuality, and they both live in New Paltz, and Ms. Pine is her assistant. Ms. Winston has stepped away from the Body Sacred in recent years to work independently, often guest teaching at meetups in Brooklyn and Boston, including the Somerville group that we just discussed, while Ms. Pine has remained with the Body Sacred and continues to assist Ms. Winston in her teaching. So we're going to begin with Sheri Winston. She's a trained midwife and an OBGYN nurse. She now works as a holistic sexuality teacher and holds the position of founder and executive director of the Intimate Arts Center in New Paltz. She was raised culturally Jewish, but also familiar with other traditions. And she uses sacred sexuality to revise medical models of the body, rewriting myth, and innovating ritual practice to rewrite Jungian discourses and other therapeutic practices. Like the others we've discussed so far, she's using myths and rituals of sacred sexuality, again, like the same things. Rewrite medical discourse, psychotherapeutic narrative, and gender roles, okay? And like them, she's also using older models of sacred sexuality to a utopian and messianic end. So for her, sexuality is sacred because of its generative power. She has her own embryology, which, true to religious tradition, articulates a theory of divine participation in human reproduction to show an intimate relationship between human and divine. She accounts for the sanctity of sexuality as follows. She says, sex makes babies, makes life, it made you and me. How could it be anything less than sacred? She saw her work as a midwife as a spiritual experience, which is the foundation of miracle. I'm quoting her, foundation of the spiritual miracle that all human beings recognize. She says that it's not just sex that got the baby, it's not just that sex got the baby started, but it's a biochemical, spiritual, energetic, physical, and psychical process. And birth is the miracle by which the divine enters the world. The fetus gets born, it takes a breath, and something enters. We could call it spirit. We go into being a receiver, a transmitter, a creator of energy, which is a life force. So for her, human beings participate by giving birth in the divine creative process, which channels divine energy to earth. She views medical narrative and establishment therapeutic practice as an impediment to the true power of sexuality and birth. To counter it, she uses a syncretistic religious myth and ritual process to rewrite medical models in Jungian mythology. In her mind, this too is utopian and messianic. Describing the centrality of birth to the human experience, she takes the Jungian myth of the hero's journey and she places birth at the center. Yeah. So this is what she says. She says that, she says first that the monomyth of the hero's journey is based on deprivation, okay? So she says men don't get to experience birth, the dangerous journey out of the self to death and then back to life with new knowledge and new powers. It's because of that they need to travel and go on this dumb hero's journey. She didn't say that. But it's because of that they need to travel. So in her mind, the monomyth of the hero's journey is a substitute for the sacred experience of birth. This is significant woman-centered revision of the narrative, and she innovates rituals and therapeutic models based on this vision. Okay? So in describing her syncretistic method of ritual innovation, she explains that when we study traditional people, wisdom traditions throughout the world, we find that there are some things that they all have in common, and I see this as a human thing. All traditional cultures have maps of how energy moves through the body. So she references the chakra map that we saw and also the sporadic one that we saw, okay? The map of the 10 emanations of the divine. So in her own practice, she's looking for where these maps integrate. She innovates ritual and therapeutic practices based on the integrated map that she constructs. Okay, so these maps provide models for Ms. Winston's ritual practice, which is to her, so ritual practice is about creating a container for an experience. Or in this case, a way to make sex more sacred or to connect with the spirit. I'm not an orthodox anything. I'm more of a neo-pagan, create your own what works for you. So she consciously draws her model from various wisdom traditions to create rituals that reimagine the relationships we've discussed: body, gender, sexuality, human being, cosmos. So I'm gonna just, I asked her to tell me how she innovates a ritual, and this is what she said. First, you create a sacred space, either with intention, calling 4 directions, drawing a circle, right? Or without, without one of those methods, okay? Set a sacred intention. You might use the magic of building an altar that takes a sacred intention and makes it concrete. Let's say that you wanted to heal your relationship to your genital. You may make an altar with a seashell. You might use flowers or pictures of flowers, have scents. Just look at what speaks to you and create your ritual from there. Could be dancing, meditating, could be sexual, could be erotic. And she says if you want to do a genital love thing, then create this space on self-pleasure. Repeat your intentions. Look at your flowers. Or repeating my yoni is sacred, or whatever. And once you've created that space, and then you're done, then you want to close it. I'd like to point out that this is the exact same structure as Cordevero's ritual. Like, you set the intention, you do the act, and then you attach significance to it, okay? And then she says, we're so privileged. We eat food from all over the world. It's the same thing with our spirituality. We can draw from an amazing wealth of spirituality. Now, because we have this wealth of options, it can be used as a path to deep empowerment, personal and radical. So Ms. Winston synthesizes wisdom traditions to reimagine the relationship to the body, to gender, and to sexuality. She is also, like the others, rewriting therapeutic narratives by revising Jungian myth to place the experience of sexuality and birth at its center, and by substituting ritual for talk. So she does work in community settings such as the Body Sacred, Meetup, and other groups. She sees this as important to her conception of the utopian power of sacred sexuality, in which it allows human participation in the divine to allow healing of individual, social, and cosmic, right? So she believes that participation in groups like these can create intentionally loving communities, which is counter to most scholarship on New Age religion. Yeah.
This particular case, as you're presenting it, makes me think about something that I was trying to formulate just throughout the presentation about present time. It really seems like you see an effect of the anxiety of like capitalism
Oh, yeah.
as what's the anxiety of how it codifies sexuality and the mandate to enjoy and to have
Can you say more about that? So the idea that it's turning sexuality into a commodity that is to be
into
enjoyed.
a commodity, and also maybe there's a sense of feeling helpless, that this insistence on the attachment of the human being to the cosmos, this idea, this metaphor is the result of not being able to being completely helpless
And to being
as
detached.
human beings, and to try to imagine some way in which whatever you do
Mm-hmm.
has any consequence at all over some other movement that you're not controlling.
I think you're right about that. I mean,
Not so much God in this case, or the God of capitalism instead.
so early scholarship on New Age religion posits exactly that, and they use Jameson to make that point. I'm seeing this as both an innovation and a nostalgia, right? Because what's interesting about it to me is that they use older models, but they detach them from their traditions, right? So they have this ambivalent relationship to older models, and they're absolutely they prioritize continuity and discontinuity at the same time.
But isn't that the model of capitalism, which is to absolutely deracinate something from its source and understand it in an exchange culture. And that's what she's articulating here as an exchange culture, right?
Yeah, except that for many people, their authority rests on their connection to the tradition, right? So one of the things I didn't include in this is I also have done an analysis of books on New Age spirituality, and those put a great deal of stock in authority that is based in tradition. So that's what's different. So it's like, in my mind, it's both, right? It's exactly what you two are saying, but at the same time, people rest on a relationship to tradition for their authority. I mean, I don't know how that, yeah.
Just to slightly shift the explanation, as an Americanist, I mean, I think this is also a specifically American context.
Let's hear.
I'm thinking particularly historically of the importance of theosophy, for example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, which similarly combined, Eastern, air quote Eastern, with Madame Blavatsky and so forth, yoga, etc., with kind of Western esotericism, and had an incredibly fertile ground in North America. Much more so than elsewhere in the Western world. So there's an American tradition, an American historical context here that I think is specific, which is related to late capitalism perhaps, but also combines this idea of newness with this sort of anxiety about tradition.
So you think that sort of ambivalent, or like, I guess it's a dual relationship, right?
Yeah.
Like, how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, the ways in which within the American context, there's a way you can sort of reimagine the past and create something new. So utopian communities, theosophical communities flourished in the 19th and 20th century, actually late 18th to the 20th century. And New Age religion is an American tradition and an American invention. So there's something specific about the American context that I think helps lend weight to this, and these are, and also even things like gospel of wealth. I mean, the fact that these are entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that's all tied up in it as well. They're making money, all
And
of this.
the fact that Krishnamurti and Khalil Gibran and others were, and Madame Blavatsky were the leaders of these. All were able to claim a privileged and traditional relationship to what they were teaching. Because of their difference, right?
Mary Baker Eddy too.
Yeah.
She less so though.
So this sort of duality or this ambivalence we're saying is particularly American.
I would argue that,
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is that this is in some ways an amplification of what religions normally do, right? Religions almost always have to do something new while pretending they're doing something old, right? But it's really amplified here, like here and now, I would say. And I think, as you two say, I think capitalism is really an important part of it.
I think in thinking about the kind of Americanized context of this, I think that there's also something kind of heavily individualized, which I think is interesting, because when I think of, my background in Catholicism, like when I think about ritual, I think about it as being like community building, but these are very much, this kind of sacred sexuality is very much individual or self-growth and a coupleness, like this kind of creation of the, which is also, I think is kind of positions it as a particularly kind of an American kind of the kind of in like the seeking, always the individual seeking for self-worth in certain ways, right? That isn't necessarily the same in other contexts.
Because it elevates competitiveness, right, rather over community. Isn't that really what capitalism at core wants?
I think it's more about like New Thought tradition. From the 19th century. Again, about self-fulfillment and using the mind, mesmerism, using the mind to control your future, gospel of wealth, the way all those things are tied together.
Yeah, and it's about this personal power for the benefit of community, I think, right? So this new thought it's about accessing your personal power, but it's about other people doing that too, and improve. No, I think it is. In this situation, I think it is.
But it's all spoken in terms of individuals, no?
Well, maybe wait till the next one.
Okay.
The last one. Should I do one more? Okay. All right. Yeah. So let's do the last one. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that she is my best friend's sister. So, okay. So now we're turning to Ruth Pine, who is Sheri Winston's assistant, and she's trained as a social worker in expressive arts therapy and in drug abuse counseling. So while Ms. Winston has scaled back her involvement with the Body Sacred, and the Body Sacred is like it's a national group, and they have conferences like a couple times a year, and they also have local community workshops. Okay, so she's deeply involved with this group. Ms. Pine is. She doesn't teach classes of her own. She facilitates workshops at the Body Sacred, and she assists Ms. Winston during classes and workshops by helping individuals, that are there. So discussing her work for Ms. Winston, Ms. Pine explains how they use rituals therapeutically, focusing on the transformative power of trance. She says, Sheri is an anatomy and physiology teacher. Here's what you've got, here's how it works, and here's what you can do with it. Then she moves into the sacred by asking how can you get into an entranced state? She brings in ritual as a contributor to that state. She is not open about the ritual component. She doesn't call it that because these are people who have been traumatized by religion. I work with people who get triggered and start to cry. I see how she teaches people who might be triggered. I'm able to take them aside and help them so that they can stay. I'm a social worker, so I'm good at that. Here, Ms. Pine explains how they use ritually induced trance to transform individual consciousness, but also to recode religious ritual practice as secular therapy. As a long-standing member of the Body Sacred, she can tell us a great deal both about the religious roots of the group and its role in creating community outside religious institutions. She says, the whole theme of TBS is to learn about the interplay of sexuality, spirituality, and community, and how we can combine those fully in our life to really experience sacred sexuality. Not everyone who comes has that connection yet of all three. For me, the other piece of sacred sexuality is that I get to call in my sacred energies, connect with God, goddesses, etc. They know that there's something holy and divine about having a sexual connection. TBS is not a pagan thing, although there's a big crossover. It's sacred because it invites gods and goddesses. So for Ms. Pine then, sacred sexuality unites human, divine, and community. Here she expresses both her own views and those of the organization. So according to Ms. Pine, the TBS approach to sacred sexuality is rooted in the history of the organization. She says, TBS was originally formed by clergy, priests and rabbis, tired of trying to speak in their pulpit about love, tired of being told they can't talk about love and sex. They felt stifled by their institutions, and they asked themselves, if we're talking about caring for another human being, about love, and how can we do this without talking about sex? David Stickle, one of the original founding members, felt it was his duty to talk to people about sex and love in the spiritual realm. He found a group of like-minded clergy of different religions, and together they founded the group, and this was in the 70s. Okay, so however, Ruth Pine says, we don't have rabbis and priests coming so much anymore. Consistent with trends in New Age religion, clerics have been replaced by people in the health field. She says, we have body workers working on trauma, energy workers, Reiki people working in sex fields, sex educators, sacred, intimate, tantric work. Just as the other groups displace religious discourse with a rewritten medical discourse, so does this one. And interestingly, it's an old enough group to show the changing leadership trends. So, yeah, it's interesting. I feel really lucky that I got her because she has been with the group for a long time. So, in speaking of her own practice outside the group, Ms. Pine explains that her myth model of sacred sexuality is securely grounded in Jewish myth and ritual, merged with paganism. In her mind, this is closer to the spiritual experience of ancient Judaism, allowing her to practice ancient rituals, usually forbidden to women, to achieve a direct experience of the divine. She says, She says, when I got there, I said, oh yeah, I'm home. This is my tribe. There are a lot of Jews there, by the way, under a weird Jewish umbrella, except that I'm a pagan. Every time I was there, we had pagan Shabbat. We had pagan Havdalah, which is the ceremony to end Shabbat. This is Jewish renewal at its best. Really going back to early roots. So in this way, she views the pagan rituals as restoring the authenticity of Jewish practice. For her, this is the actualization of Kabbalah, which is an experience of the feminine divine presence, the Shekhinah. She believes that there are so many Jewish rituals that match pagan rituals, that line up, that bring me into contact with the Shekhinah. So for her, pagan ritual serves a still more important function of correcting the gender bias of Jewish ritual practice. She comes from a family of Kohanim, or priests, but because of her gender, she's barred from performing their ritual duties. And she says, the fact that I'm a Bat Kohen, a daughter of a Kohen priest, holds a little more weight for me than for the Shekhinah. It's always been a special thing in my life. I've watched my father perform the Yom Kippur service. If I were in temple time more than 1,000 years ago, I could have been a priestess, if there was conservative egalitarian then. I could have been performing the service. Okay? So she appreciates paganism because it offers an egalitarian ritual model. She says in the pagan service, the woman is just as important as the man. So there's no reason that I couldn't priestess as well for sacred rituals. And in terms of the Shekhinah, that's where it lines up for me in the pagan world. So through her pagan practice, she can overcome the exclusion of women from Jewish priestly ritual to achieve a direct experience of divinity. Her involvement with TBS and other groups allows a closer connection to her Jewish upbringing and a feeling that she is truly realizing the myth and ritual models of Kabbalah at the heart of Judaism. So finally, the utopian messianic component is very much present for Ms. Pine. She views the body having sex as the axis mundi, a pillar connecting the three realms and bringing divine energy down to earth. So, heavens, earth, and underworld, okay? And she sees sacred sexuality as a means to change therapeutic practice for the better. This is a healing energy which she aligns with the Jewish practice of tikkun olam, repair of the cosmos. She explains, well, for me, I think that anytime someone gets to orgasm or has beautiful sex, you are healing the community and the world, not just yourself. If everybody was having sex, not buying guns, we wouldn't have war. For me, this is tikkun olam. You can tell I know her well. I've heard that. Okay. Sacred sexuality, then, is the central component in the transformation of the cosmos. To that end, she believes that good sex therapy is the key to transforming society. So as a part of the movement toward tikkun olam, she too believes that therapeutic models need to be changed. She explains, therapists don't talk about sexuality with their clients. They don't talk about sex. They're at a great loss with couples counselors. She sees sexuality as a deeply healing force, and she imagines herself teaching therapists how sacred sexuality brings divine energy down to everybody. In this way, the experience of sacred sexuality, its teaching, and the subsequent revision of therapeutic narrative and practice is key to the utopian messianic vision. And here it's clear, as in other narratives, first of all, it's a constituent part of her community, and second, she uses the same messianic ritual model to understand the meaning and power of sacred sexuality. So for her, they're connected to community and to messianism or utopianism. Okay? So, in considering all these sources together, the Jewish esoteric sources and the interviews with sacred sexuality, sex magic teachers, it's clear that the essential components of ritualized sexuality remain much the same. Okay? They believe that human sexuality emulates and therefore invokes the primordial creation, that it unites human beings with the divine and allows access to divine power. Because they understand ritualized sex as an emulation of the divine, they also believe that power could be used for the betterment or the salvation of the individual and the whole cosmos. At the same time, however, as sacred sexuality rituals move from Kabbalistic circles to New Age communities, they change. As we can see, they're combined with Hindu models first. Second, they move out of men's hands into women's. And third, they move away from scripted ritual performance toward a more fluid and improvised form. Finally, their target discourses change as they use ritual to rewrite social social discourse, religious discourse, and scientific and therapeutic discourse to operate outside of institutions. Finally, this research pushes us to rethink ritual. Performance studies methodologies see ritual as the performance of a script. Bruce Lincoln argues something similar, showing that rituals enact myth in order to form community, all three of which are regulated by institutions. Turner sees rituals as transformative, while Durkheim views ritual as constructive, inscribing communal values on a sacred object to constitute community. Catherine Bell counters the view that all rituals are constructive, pointing out that some are degenerative, tearing down community that others insist they build up. Okay? These rituals combine ever so many of these definitions. So first, they don't enact myth or sacred discourse, but as a group, they begin always with individuals and their situations to criticize institutions and their myths. In this way, they build new communities, and in this, they are simultaneously degenerative and constructive. They show another important thing about ritual, namely that it goes for what is most vital in communal life. At this moment, therapeutic discourse fulfills a similar function to religious discourse as it was used in the past. The same is true of scientific narrative. In this way, in order to be effective, it must operate on practice and discourse that is vital to the practitioners of ritual. Thus, we may assert the following: that sacred ritual can exist apart from sacred discourse, that it is effective and transformative, that it can be simultaneously constructive and destructive, and that it goes for the jugular. What is most vital and powerful in a culture, and that it often enacts an ambivalent experience about that power. Thanks, everyone. I'm talking to you, because you are awesome. Questions?
Thank you so much for that fabulous talk.
Marla, so you are doing so much here. So much to talk about. I think the first comment that I want to make is that I really admire and respect your project, which I actually see. I see the angle that you're taking on these contemporary sacred sex educators as really important. I think you're doing a reparative reading. That's Eve Sedgwick's term. I see it as a really an imperative from queer cultural criticism to take seriously the genuine cosmological innovations of this subculture that has so many laughable things about it. So, you know, it occupies this degraded place in our culture for intellectuals like us. There's stuff that makes our skin crawl, the colonialism, like buffet style cultural appropriation, and the like blatant white privilege, and the like we eat food from all over the world, so why not ritual from all over the world? You're turning a serious eye on, like, no, what new is being made right now in 21st century America about how ritual works and what it is. It is such an admirable, I think, like queer, reparative, non-judgmental, anthropological, descriptive project. You're like, this is happening, y'all. This is happening right now. 21st century American ritual practice. You might not like it. You might laugh at it. It's sketchy in all kinds of ways, but they are doing this. Health is taking the place of clergy. Like you've pointed to, like, all of these really huge seismic phenomena that are going on at this moment in this little corner, this little degraded corner of American thought, and taking it seriously, I think is so cool.
Thanks. I think Fred's doing the same thing, only maybe better, probably. Go on then.
I just
Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I just curious about just one little thing about the replacement of the clergy by the health discourse, right? So is that reflecting the kinds of problems that people say that they're coming in with? I mean, did they come in saying, I've got a spiritual problem, but I've got a health problem?
Oh, so you're asking, how do people come to them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, in general, how are people presenting their issues?
I think that's a great question. I think for if they're coming to Meetup, they're joining that group, right? They're saying, I want to join a group that focuses on sacred sexuality, right? So they're focusing, they're presenting it as a desire for that. However, Kelle Sparta started out as a career coach and wound up talking about sex. I think I'm just going to have to guess. I'm going to have to say they're saying, I feel lousy and I need help.
Could
I knew what you were
there
gonna
you
say.
go.
Thank you for that, by the way. I didn't mention it.
I wonder too if it could be like where, I mean, that the discussion we were having earlier, Marla, about, you know, and I take seriously like this, that, right, like it didn't used to be that, I mean, well, that are women leaving kind of sacred space, like institutionalized sacred spaces because of kind of the sexism embedded within
Yeah.
hierarchies, but also, right, they kind of like, you know, why would you ever go to a Catholic priest to talk about sexuality? I mean, like, no, in all, like, right, and
They
most
don't
of the
play
time
the
it-
game, they don't make it the rules.
Right, or, right, well, because like, you know, in the 1930s and 40s, you wouldn't have had, like, if you were gonna talk about sexuality with anyone, it might be the priest, right? But now,
It was there.
right, because that was what was there, and that was like, that was part of, because spiritual, like, your sexuality and morality were tied together, right? But now if you have an issue, a sexual issue, you wouldn't think about going to your priest, right? You'd think about going to
a therapist.
a therapist,
But-
right?
But forgive me, I just want to say that I think that there's a historical dimension here that needs to be credited, and
Tell
that
us.
is that this is Eros. This is the discursive construction of the 1960s, right? That was in evidence in Marcuse, in Reich, in Norman O. Brown. This is, what's interesting to me here is the persistence of a very substantial cultural tradition in religion as opposed to social and political life.
Can you say more about that, please?
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, so what Eros, right, ultimately claims is that the long sought merger of Marx and Freud, right, will happen through a kind of sexual revolution, right, which will understand that in coupling, connection is valued over differentiation, right? And that's, of course, why so much of the 1960s raised the idea of orgies and other forms of sexual life. That died out,
Yeah.
and this movement started in the early 70s. So there's a direct kind of connection that persists in this regard. That seems to me really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that there are various historical moments in which sexuality is understood to constitute community and to save the community. That's not the only one, right?
Right, of course.
So, but it probably sprang from that, merged with earlier models. So one of the things that I didn't say about Cordovero is that Cordovero, who was the 16th century Kabbalist from Sfat, right? He didn't work alone, right? He was part of a major move toward messianism in his community, where people formed chavarot, so they were groups of 10 or more people, men, and they all focused on developing rituals around particular mitzvot or commandments, right? And they had these confessional groups, and they also, as a group, did whatever mitzvot or commandments that they could, and they believed that if they got one perfect group, they would redeem all of society, right? So he had his group of disciples, which was far more than 10 men, and they were innovating these rituals, right? To the same end that it sounds like you're talking about. So it sounds like these are doubly fertile. Like, so the moment that came before, and like immediately before, and then the 16th century moment, which was kind of carried through Hasidism into the present.
But the question is the Jewish inheritance that you're pointing to operative with these folks, or is it really the 1960s American moment? And I'm picking up much more of the 60s American than I am of the religious tradition.
Okay, what do you want to say to that?
So I kind of wanted to piggyback off of that. So I thought this was absolutely fascinating. So when you were presenting, you hinted at having done work within like traditional Jewish institutional communities,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
organized religious communities, right? So are you seeing the same sort of trends within that context? in these
Trends as in which?
So specifically, what I had in mind was like one of the things I've seen in sort of recent years is like around the mikveh tradition.
Oh yeah.
And that seemed to have some parallels with what you were talking about here. So I don't know if people are familiar with that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like after menstruating, women go to the mikveh, which is this
Ritual bath.
Like ritual bath, and it's sort of it has. I mean, I actually don't know much except about like the kind of reclaiming tradition.
So if you're Orthodox and you want to have sex with your husband, when you've menstruated, then afterwards you go to the ritual bath to purify yourself, right? And so then it's a purification, but it's also a rebirth, right? Go ahead.
Well, no. So there's like a number of situations at the sort of birth-death nexus that where you're not supposed to have contact with other people, and this sort of like during and after menstruation is like considered to be one of the most periods of most separation.
Mm-hmm.
And so recently, like women have started to. It's often talked about as like a reclaiming, right? Reclaiming that ritual.
Yeah. Right. So people people who are not Orthodox now practice that ritual as a self-sanctification and as a community building exercise as well, because women go together often, or they have, So is that so?
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like that has a lot of parallels to some of the things that you were talking about here, right? So it's like it's been reanalyzed.
Yeah. So it's Jewish Renewal who have done that. And there's a huge Jewish Renewal crossover with some of these groups as well, especially the Body Sacred.
Right.
So, so it's like, it's both. I really think it's American, but I think it's also filtered through this lens of religious cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I didn't grow up here and wasn't educated here, so I see a lot of these things as particularly American.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly the sort of flowering of many different kinds of religious movements in the mostly 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah.
I see that as very American. But a lot of the things I observe is this inherent tension in the United States between individualism and community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important because most Americans are not aware that they don't have a community. I mean, seriously, what is all this health insurance stuff about?
Oy, oy.
That is we don't want anything that speaks of taking care of each other.
Uh-huh.
If you talk to a Canadian about health insurance, my sister who's just battled cancer says, and she lives in Canada, thank God I didn't have to worry about bills, medical bills.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing financial attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And we look after each other. No one cares that they pay taxes all their life and not have to access the system because thank God that means they've been healthy.
Yeah.
Whereas here, it's I don't want to pay tax for somebody else's
else.
heart surgery.
Yeah.
And I think this really permeates a lot of American things,
Mm-hmm.
that there is no fundamental, unquestioned belief in community.
Mm-hmm.
So people are searching for community while still trying to be individuals. And this individualism is a real sort of core American value. I mean, let's just not allow refugees in because they're not part of us.
Right.
And I think that I think a lot of these religious things that crop up here are this fundamental search for community that isn't allowed by the individuals.
Yes.
I think you're right. I think on that happy note.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming and for the last of you who stuck it out till forever. Of course you do.